The BMW GS lineage of motorcycles are synonymous with adventure touring, namely because its R80 model back in 1980 featured in the International Motorcycle and Bicycle Show in Cologne, Germany, all but initiated the whole sector of the industry. So how does this staple in the GS lineup, the F650GS, compare to its more notable competitor, the Kawasaki KLR650? Stay tuned to find out. Greetings riders, Nick here with Pegasus Motorcycle Tours and Consulting, finally bringing you a comparative review of two motorcycles that are icons in the 650 lineup. This is the GS by BMW and the KLR by Kawasaki, two of the most iconic motorcycles in adventure touring. Now one can argue that every motorcycle in its elemental essence can be an adventure touring machine, and that would be honestly true because some of the more interesting people that I would love to share a beer with at a campfire have crossed the world on everything from a Honda Goldwing to a Yamaha R1 to a Vespa scooter and even a sidecar rig. So adventure touring really is in the imagination of the rider. However, it wasn't until the 80s that BMW actually first focused on creating a motorcycle that was very capable on dirt and on asphalt and can carry a lot of luggage and a passenger with a large tank for a longer range. From then on, the adventure touring industry was born. So from 1993 on, when the Funduro was first introduced, the Funduro 650 Gelandestraße, which means backcountry street, all the companies started to create their own versions of adventure touring motorcycles. And now adventure touring is still the fastest growing sector of the motorcycling industry. BMW created 4 different versions of the GS motorcycle. We have the 650, the 750, previously the 700, the 850, previously 800, and the King of the Road 1250, previously 1200 GS Adventure. Now, none of these 3 bigger brothers are bikes that I would consider taking abroad on a solo adventure. And if you watch my KLR versus the DR video, you know why I feel that way. I've lived in a lot of Latin American places where I would not feel comfortable pulling at a red light and waiting there, especially at night, on a motorcycle that's at least 3 times as expensive over there, being expensive here. You know, the close to 600-pound GS Adventure with all the weight and all the luggage, etc. It's upwards of 20 grand nowadays, and that's money that, you know, you could spend elsewhere. I think those bikes are amazing. Don't misunderstand me. They're very capable motorcycles. They can do it all, and they're not uncommon picks for people looking to around the world. However, I believe in the type of touring that I like to do, which is really hardcore backcountry solo adventure touring. I have to be able to pick that bike up. I have to be able to work on it, to have full confidence in the machine. So those 3 bigger brothers are simply too big, too bulky, too expensive, too high maintenance. And I think their space is more reserved for European and North American touring, where the required premium gasoline is easy to get and the dealer support is ample and abundant. Actually, the BMW dealers would argue that's their biggest strength, is that global BMW GS support. But my experience has been the opposite, unfortunately. On the filming of the Epic Rides episode number 2 of the White Rim Road in Utah, my partner Rudy crashed his 1200 GS Adventure and broke a simple clutch reservoir. It was a Saturday by the time we got down. Sunday, the dealers closed. Monday, unfortunately, the dealers closed. So it took us 4 days to get this part. We ended up having to get it from a private party from eBay, had it rush shipped. By then, a huge storm swooped in and destroyed the roads. So then we had to rent an elevated Wrangler with 34-inch tires just to be able to make it back to the bike and fix it. So I found that lack of assistance and ability in a place like Moab on a weekend when everybody's out touring in this mecca of overlanding and adventure touring. A lack of BMW parts seemed kind of perplexing to me, so I've never even considered taking a bike, you know, south of the border. A lot of people will disagree with me on that, but that was my experience. I finally found this bike on sale, bought it, took it out to the desert, and really got surprised at how well it behaves. What a great motorcycle it really is. A lot of people argue that it's a perfect commuter, entry-level beginner bike, and it is all of that, but it can be so much more depending on what you want to do with it. I think this can be a really satisfying all-round adventure touring bike, the one bike that you have in the garage. Let's see why. Let's see how these two bikes compare, and let's start with the wheels. As you can see, the KLR has a larger 21-inch front wheel compared to the 19 on the standard edition of the GS650. They both have a 17-inch rear. They're both tube tires, so you need to carry extra tubes. I only carry the front as an emergency because you can fit the front larger tube into the rear in an emergency, but they are bulky and heavy. So thank you to one of my viewers who commented on the DR versus KLR video who suggested the installation of the new tech tubeless system, which allows you to really run super low PSI and actually run without a tube inside. So it requires a little bit of rim modification, and it basically pushes a tubeless tire against the rim so that it beads in place, and now you can run tubeless tires. Actually, these are Metzeler Tourance tires. They come stock with the GS, German tire, great, excellent tire. Road oriented, but did really, really well, even at 25 PSI on ankle deep sand. So I was really surprised. You have the 19-inch front and the 17-inch rear, and then they do come with the aluminum skid plate. The aluminum skid plate is kind of thin, and you will hit it. It is a really low setting bike at 7 inches compared to the KLR's 8.4, I believe. 8.3. So you will definitely bash it, but it takes the force, so I don't know, for me it performed quite well, you know. The KLR does come with its own bash plate, but it's plastic and you'll most certainly crack it the first time it actually contacts the ground. So those are upgrades that, you know, could be done on both bikes. It does come with the center stand. The KLR doesn't. I actually use the snapjack system to lube my chain and to change the front tire when I need it. I like that system more. It's less weight. I can't really use the center stand on a lot of soft dirt, and especially if I have it laden with weight. So, but it's nice to have that out of the gate. As you can see, the chain is on the right side of this motorcycle compared to the left side of the KLR. I like the system more because I can pull on the handles, let the weight rest on the side stand, and with the right foot rotate the wheel as I'm spraying the chain. And I do this every morning while I'm packing so that the lube has time to dry and whatnot. But I actually make a video about chain care and tire care. It's a 3-part video dedicated to ADV solo riders, such as our entire channel, where we talk about the kit that you need to carry, tire care and upgrades, and everything you need to know about tire care for ADV adventure touring. So please stay tuned for that. You have plenty of tire options for both bikes. And as I said, this bike does sit a little bit lower, 7 inches compared to the 8.3 for the KLR. And the suspension travel on these really thin pogo stick looking forks is also limiting. That's probably the most limiting factor. You get 6.6 on the front, 6.4 on the rear for the GS as compared to the 7.9, 7.3 on the rear for the KLR. So you do get more off-road capability on the KLR itself. But what the GS does benefit from is a lower weight. It only weighs less 10 pounds than the KLR, so it sits at about 421 pounds compared to the 432 or so. Wet weight, obviously unladen with any of the extras. But you don't feel it as much on the GS because this here is a plastic tank, fits about 4.6 gallons compared to the KLR's 6.1 gallon tank. And I really love that system because it just keeps all the weight down low. So the bike is really manageable for those younger riders, for shorter riders, for female riders. It's one of the more popular best-selling bikes in that regard because you can be firmly planted and that gives you so much more confidence. You're not throwing it around in corners, all this top heavy weight like the KLR has up top. In the DR versus KLR video, which I really urge you to view, it's one of our most popular, most commented and most participated in videos. I talk about the benefits of this huge tank, namely because you can fit more luggage on the side with a magnetic tank bag. In general, the KLR allows for a little more luggage just in virtue of the flat rear seat with the bigger OEM luggage carrier in the back. The GS does not have that ability. It has a small rack. That part itself is plastic, and I don't have a lot of confidence holding on to it. I heard in other models, the grab rails for the passengers are also heated when you run the heated grip option, which this bike does come with. That's another benefit. The heated grip option is standard on this bike, at least in the US, North American market, as is an ABS button that you can shut off. How cool is that? An entry-level motorcycle with ABS that you can actually turn off. That's pretty neat. I mean, that's a little more advanced option than you would normally get on an entry-level machine. So it does reset after every time you turn on the bike, but no big deal. It's kind of neat to have that. It does come with plastic handguards. Both bikes do. I had to upgrade mine for the KLR with Tusk proper handguards, you know, with the bark buster type protection. You kind of need that. I think the handlebars on the BMW could be raised an inch or two just to make you sit straight, not bend over longer periods of time. That becomes really unbearable. If you do stand on the bike, you'll notice that the foot pegs are very uncomfortable. They're very narrow and they hurt the balls of your feet after a while. And in general, although their overall dimensions are very similar, the GS feels a little more cramped. You know, I had the feeling that I needed to stretch out my legs more often than I do with the KLR. So that's something to consider as well. The seat does sit 5 inches lower than the KLR at about 30 inches compared to the 35. That's huge. I'm actually firmly planted on ground, and with all the weight sitting down low, I have so much more confidence, especially in dirt, especially in ankle deep sand where the bike is just dancing and swooping all over the place and you're just kind of letting it do its thing. So that is kind of neat. I did utilize the same luggage system that I have for the KLR. You can see it on the other side. Massive 46-liter side cases by Moose Engineering, and I made an experiment. I connected them to Tusk removable side carriers, and they worked excellently. I gotta say, I'm very, very surprised. They're incredibly wide, but I was able to use the real estate of the case at night as a table and whatnot to eat. And it's a cool system. Take a look at that particular video. It was more or less an experiment to see what I could do if I can put those two together, and they came out really well. So I was able to fit that whole system on the GS as well, and I took it to the desert a few times and really surprised me how well this bike behaved, partly because of its awesome engine. This engine is built by Rotex, an Austrian company, at least until fairly recently. Before the 2003 models were made in partnership with Aprilia, the Italian company. They had their own version of this bike, the Pegasus. I've test-ridden that bike and I almost pulled the trigger, but then I found out it has 2 carbs, and I hate carb work. I absolutely hate carb work, especially when you're on the road and you have to do it in some village or on the side of the road somewhere because you picked up some bad gas and you have to clean it out. And it's just really tedious when you have to do that every other month, you know. I would much prefer not to have a carb. So that bike had 2, and I said, no, thank you. Even on a 650 single cylinder. This bike does not have it. It's electronically fuel injected. The KLR does have it. For me, it's a handicap, but for you, you might prefer the simplicity of a carb. So to each their own. They're both liquid cooled, double overhead cams, and both really, really solid engines. This one has 4 valves per the cylinder, and after 2004, it introduced a second spark plug. So the burn is so much more efficient and cleaner. For that reason, this bike gets an astounding claimed 74 miles per gallon at a constant 55 mile per hour speed. That's pretty outstanding. Both bikes will get about 60 more or less miles a gallon on average. Obviously, that will depend on the rider, the luggage, etc. But even though this is a 4.6 tank versus the 6.1, they both will get you above 200 miles range. So that's kind of neat. You know, range is really, really important for adventure touring, and they both have it. So what I don't like about the bike is, well, for one, it has these really big, heavy 2 exhaust pipes. They are heavy, so that would be a really easy way to upgrade the weight, you know, downgrade the weight and upgrade the power if you change the pipes. I love the fact that this engine is so much more predictable and more powerful. Actually, it's got 50 horsepower and 44 foot-pounds of torque compared to the KLR's 47 horsepower and 36 foot-pounds of torque. You definitely feel it, you know, with all that weight down low as well. To pass a vehicle at 65 miles an hour going uphill, laden with luggage, hitting a headwind is no problem on this bike, and I really, really enjoyed it. It actually feels like a motorcycle. You ride it like a motorcycle, and there's power there. You know, it's never going to be enough. It's a 650, right? We buy it for its simplicity and its low weight. That's why we buy 650s. But yeah, I think this is really surprised me at how much power you get. They both have a 5-speed gearbox that performs really well. Normally, I change to a 16 sprocket front for the BMW, for the KLR, just to have a different power range structure. I found that I could tour at 70, 80 miles an hour on the desert, highway roads, see an interesting entrance to the desert, and then be in first gear for the next few hours in ankle-deep sand. No problem whatsoever. It never once stalled on me due to the gearing ratio. So most of the power is set very high up. You get to power, you know, past 55 mile an hour mark. But you know, running at the first gear at like sub 10 mile an hour speeds, it performed completely satisfactory, and that was a surprise for me as well. So you do get a preload adjustment for the rear suspension on both bikes. Here's without tools, and here you have to use a 14mm socket. Another thing that I don't like is the looks of the bike. I know we're not supposed to talk about the looks of the bike, but I find the angular shape, the straight shape of the frame and the swing arm to totally clash with the rest of the bubbly features of the bike, which I really dislike, especially these little two lines on the gas tank that make the bike look like a toy, like some kind of Hot Wheels toy. And I really dislike the color, not the yellow, but the you know, plastic looking silver light gray color. It really makes it look all plastic, and I don't like that much at all. But again, to each their own. This little container behind the pillion, it locks, but it doesn't need to lock because it doesn't fit like it needs to fit. So you can just bend it back and take it off, and there's a little space there for your booklets and whatnot. It comes with its own toolbox, obviously, that kind of thing. But it does not, unfortunately, have a temperature gauge for ambient temperature, nor does it have a gas gauge. Every adventure touring motorcycle ought to have a gas gauge at least, so you don't have to be counting your mileage. Another thing that I found kind of annoying with the whole display system is that the trip meter always reverts back to the total mileage counter. And that's annoying if you navigate by the tenths of a mile. If you're counting tenths of a mile to get to your next point of interest, you always have to be reverting back to it by pressing the button. It's kind of annoying when you're on sand and your handlebars are just doing whatever they need to be doing. When you're navigating the desert, that's the way that I have to navigate sometimes, and I don't have time to be like pressing the button every few minutes to revert back to my trip meter. I need to know where I am, because one, you know, dry arroyo, dry riverbed meets another, and if you miss it, then you're just lost, and you don't got time to be, you know, roaming around the desert, you know, in a 110-degree heat and whatnot. So yeah, that's one little thing that I guess you learn when you're adventure touring, these little aspects of it. The whole plastics up top hide the battery and the oil reserve tank, and they come off in 3 pieces. You kind of have to get rid of all of that to access the battery. I guess no comments about that design. They had to do it that way to keep the weight low, so I appreciate that. I've always had an affinity for BMW. I lived in Munich, actually. I would pass by the BMW museum every day on my way to the gym in the Olympia Center, and I have great respect for German engineering. And my father had an old Audi A80 back in 1984, blue, and when I was a kid I would hang on to the square headrest behind him, and I would act like I'm driving too. So I have this real affinity for German engineering, and you get it with the BMW GS line. Top of the line motorcycles that really can do it all. Very smooth engine, awesome performance, predictable, reliable, etc., etc. So, is this an awesome adventure touring motorcycle that you should consider? Absolutely. This would be a phenomenal adventure touring motorcycle as well as a commuter. My views of the KLR you already know. If you've watched the DR versus the KLR video, I think it's a phenomenal motorcycle. The only reason why I stuck with it instead of the DR650 is because I already have a KLR in Europe, and it's just so much nicer to be able to work on both bikes with the same tools, same spare parts, valve clearance, job, etc. Now, it's important to say that there is a version of this bike that is actually a better comparison to the KLR. The version is more off-road oriented. Before, it was known as the Dakar. In more modern years, it's known as the Sertao. Sertao is a region in northeastern Brazil that's very arid. It's kind of like their cowboy zone, more or less. Very, very interesting lifestyle, very, very hard life for some that live up there due to the arid nature of the environment. The whole cowboy culture is beautiful in Brazil. I've actually had the pleasure of living up there as well. I lived in Maceió. Maceió is the capital city of Alagoas, which is in the Sertão region. I love that place. I love the food, I love the people, I love the culture, and I want to own the Sertão for that reason. So after a few months of searching, I finally find the Sertão in Southern California. Look at that motorcycle. It's just gorgeous. It has all the improvements needed on the F650GS. Everything that I wanted that bike to do better, this bike does. And I gotta give it to BMW for really paying attention to the details. But for those particular details, please keep an eye out for an upcoming video, the review of the Sertão itself. It's such a great bike that it deserves a video of its own. So take a look at that. Consider subscribing so that you're notified when that video comes out. And also Please participate in the conversation so that we can help this channel grow. We can help, learn from each other, and we can bring more people to this community and help bring more videos of this nature to viewers like you. Thank you again for watching. In the meantime, ride safe. Nick, I'm out.